The laughter at my dining table that Father's Day sounded expensive. Crystal glasses clinked. Candlelight shimmered against polished silverware. And there, between the half-empty wine bottles and the roast I'd spent hours preparing, my daughter tossed a wrinkled piece of paper toward me. Happy Father's Day. Dad. Rachel said, her smile sharp enough to cut. If you win, remember half is mine. The paper landed beside my plate. A $2 lottery ticket. I picked it up, carefully smoothing the folds with fingers stained from 40 years of engine grease. Very thoughtful, I said, forcing a smile. Oh, wait. Rachel turned toward her father-in-law, Douglas Pierce, the kind of man who wore wealth like cologne. You haven't seen your gift yet. She lifted a velvet-lined box from the floor. Inside, under soft gold light, gleamed 2 first-class cruise tickets. 2 weeks in the Caribbean, $13,000. You deserve it, Doug, for everything you've done for us. Douglas adjusted his cufflinks and laughed, that deep, satisfied laugh that always followed money. Now that's a real gift. His eyes flicked toward me. Your daughter's quite generous. The room filled with polite chuckles. My sister looked down at her plate. My nephew coughed into his napkin. And me? I just stared at that $2 ticket, tiny, weightless, humiliating. When dinner ended, their car doors slammed outside, engines fading into the night. I sat alone at the table, the leftover scent of steak and perfume twisting in the air. Under the dim light, the lottery ticket gleamed faintly beside my cold coffee cup. Then my phone buzzed with a notification, Bank Alert Premium Travel Services, $13,000. My smile froze. Somewhere between laughter and betrayal, the truth had already started to cost me. Would you still call it family money if it was stolen from you? Morning sunlight spilled through the thin curtains of my kitchen, painting the counter in pale gold. The house smelled of coffee and motor oil, 2 scents that had defined most of my adult life. I'd been up since 6 out of habit. Old mechanics never sleep in even after retirement. The dining table still bore traces of last night's celebration. A forgotten wine glass, a wrinkled napkin, and the $2 lottery ticket lying exactly where I'd left it. The laughter from that dinner had already turned sour in my memory. I poured my coffee and sat down, pulling my old laptop closer. For 40 years, I'd started every morning the same way, checking bank statements, balancing expenses, tracking every dollar like it was a living thing. It wasn't about greed. It was about survival. Electric bill paid. Grocery store, $67.45. Hardware store, $18.09. Then the next line froze me. Premium travel services. $13,000. The word sat on the screen like a slap. I blinked twice, refreshing the page, hoping it was an error. It wasn't. My hands trembled as I reached for my phone. Rachel's number appeared after the 3rd ring. Hey, Dad, she said, her tone bright, distracted. Everything okay? I kept my voice steady. There's a charge on my account, $13,000 to a travel agency. Do you know anything about that? Silence. Then a small practiced laugh. Oh, that. Yeah, I booked Douglas's cruise. It was a Father's Day gift. I felt my pulse in my throat. With my money. She sighed the way people sigh when they're tired of being questioned. Dad, come on. It's family money. You've got plenty sitting there. Eric and I thought it'd be nice to do something special for him. He's helped us so much. Rachel, I said slowly, you took money from my account without asking. That's not family money. That's theft. Her tone sharpened. Don't make this dramatic. You wouldn't have spent it anyway. It's just sitting there doing nothing. I was saving it, I whispered. For emergencies, for your future. We'll consider this an emergency for gratitude, she snapped. Douglas has been more of a father to us lately than anyone. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. My daughter, the little girl who once cried when she scraped her knee, who once called me her hero, was defending the man who'd taken my seat at her table. Rachel, I said, voice barely steady, when your mother died? I gave you access to that account in case something happened to me. Not so you could spend it. You're overreacting, she said flatly. You'll get over it. Anyway, I'm late for a meeting. Love you, Dad. The line went dead before I could answer. I sat there, the phone still pressed to my ear, the kitchen clock ticking louder than usual. The sunlight that had seemed gentle minutes ago now felt cruel, exposing every crack in my quiet life. On the counter, a photograph leaned against the wall. Rachel at 6 years old, smiling with a missing tooth grease smudged on her cheek from helping me fix an old Chevy. I'd kept that photo beside the toaster for 20 years. I turned it face down. The smell of burnt toast filled the room, but I didn't move to stop it. My mind was stuck replaying her words. Douglas has been more of a father to us lately. Us, like I'd already been replaced. The rest of the day unfolded in a fog. I cleaned the house, rearranged tools in my garage, tried to convince myself I was fine. But every small sound, the hum of the fridge, the groan of the pipes, reminded me I was alone. Around noon, I opened the old wooden drawer by my sink where I kept paperwork, insurance tax forms, and a crumpled letter my wife had written years ago. The top sheet was the bank authorization form, the one that gave Rachel joint access after her mother's funeral. I'd signed it while still wearing my black suit, hands shaking, heartbroken. In case something happens to me, I'd said back then, you'll need to pay the bills. Now, years later, the same signature stared back at me, mocking my trust. I picked up a pen, ready to call the bank and revoke her access. My thumb hovered over the phone's keypad. Then I stopped. A part of me, the part that still saw the child I'd raised, hesitated. Maybe she'd realize what she'd done. Maybe she'd call back, apologize. Maybe she'd remember the man who used to walk her to school in the rain. But the phone stayed silent. By evening, the rain started to fall softly against the windows. Portland rain, the kind that seeps into everything, slow and patient. I stood by the window watching the streetlights blur through the drizzle. Across the road, my neighbor Mrs. Langston waved from her porch holding a tray of muffins. She'd done that every Sunday since my wife passed. I waved back weakly, pretending nothing was wrong. When I turned around, my reflection in the glass startled me. The same man who once believed hard work could fix anything now looked like someone who'd lost something more precious than money trust. I poured another cup of coffee, though I'd had too many already. My hands shook slightly as I opened my laptop again, staring at the line that started it all. Premium travel services, $13,000. In another tab, Rachel's social media page was filled with photos from last night. Her and Eric smiling beside Douglas, champagne glasses raised, captions celebrating the men who built our family. No mention of me, not even a tag. The comments were full of hearts and admiration. You're such a wonderful daughter. Eric's dad must be so proud. I closed the laptop. The house creaked as the heater kicked on. I walked to the back door, stepping onto the small porch. The rain had turned heavier, washing the air clean. My old pickup sat under the streetlight, paint dull but loyal. It was the only thing in my life that hadn't betrayed me. I ran my hand along its cold hood the way one might touch an old friend. Guess it's just us again, buddy, I murmured. Inside, I hung my jacket, turned off the kitchen light, and stood in the dark for a while. The silence pressed around me, thick and heavy. Somewhere in that silence, I heard my wife's voice, the memory of it, really. Don't let her harden you, Harold. She's still your girl. But tonight, she didn't feel like my girl. She felt like a stranger. As I headed to bed, I glanced at the lottery ticket on the table. Its numbers meant nothing to me, just paper and ink, a cruel joke from someone who once called me Dad. Still, before turning off the light, I whispered to the empty room, I hope you're happy, Rachel. The rain answered for her, steady and relentless against the roof. He couldn't sleep. The rain kept whispering against the roof, steady and cold. So he grabbed his flashlight and walked out to the garage where the scent of oil and metal felt like home. His old workbench was still cluttered with wrenches, bolts, and a dusty photograph of his wife taped above the tool rack. Her smile hadn't faded, not even after 20 years. Hanging beside it was her wedding ring, looped through a piece of fishing line he'd tied there the day she died. I'll take care of her, he'd whispered that night. Now, standing there alone, he realized he'd kept that promise too long. Maybe love had turned into a leash neither of them could break. Would you forgive your child if they said stealing was love? The rain had stopped by dawn, leaving the air heavy with that damp metallic smell Portland always carried after a long night. Harold sat in his garage with a mug of lukewarm coffee, the same seat he'd taken thousands of times before. The workbench in front of him was a collage of his life-rusted wrenches, old invoices and photographs curling at the edges. One picture caught his eye, Rachel at 10 years old, standing beside a red bicycle. Her hair was tangled under a helmet too big for her, and grease smudged her cheeks. He'd rebuilt that bike from parts scavenged at the junkyard after her mother's funeral. She'd called it the flying machine. Back then, the house had felt impossibly empty. Every creak in the floorboards sounded like his wife calling from another room. Every silence reminded him of what he'd lost. He remembered sitting on the edge of Rachel's bed that first week, watching her pretend to sleep, her little fists clutching the blanket. "Are you okay, sweetheart?" he'd whispered. She hadn't opened her eyes. "You'll fix it, right, Daddy? You fix everything." He'd swallowed the lump in his throat and said yes, even though he knew some things couldn't be fixed. From that day on, he worked like a man possessed, 16-hour shifts at the auto shop weekends, rebuilding engines in his garage just to pay for groceries and after-school programs. When Rachel wanted a laptop for her homework, he sold his vintage tools collection. When she needed braces, he canceled his fishing trip to Alaska, the one thing he'd promised himself after retirement. He gave and gave and gave, and for years it seemed enough. She grew up polite, bright, and ambitious, the kind of kid teachers loved to talk about. He still remembered the day she got accepted into Oregon State University. She'd burst into the garage waving the letter, shouting, "I did it, Dad!" He'd lifted her off the ground, laughing and crying at the same time. "Of course you did. You always do." Then she'd noticed his oil-stained hands leaving smudges on her white blouse. "Dad, careful," she said, half laughing, half wincing. "I've got to show this to Mom's picture." He'd laughed it off, but the moment stayed lodged like a splinter under his skin. The distance started small, missed calls, shorter visits, holidays spent with Eric's family this year. He told himself she was busy. That's what parents do, they make excuses for the people they love. The memory that still burned brightest came from her college graduation. He'd driven 4 hours in his pickup wearing a suit that smelled faintly of gasoline, no matter how much he washed it. When he arrived, she met him outside the auditorium, eyes darting nervously to her friends in expensive clothes. "Dad," she said softly, "maybe it's better if you don't sit up front. The seats are kinda for family." He'd smiled as if he hadn't heard the last part. "That's all right, sweetheart. I'll watch from the back." After the ceremony, she'd posed for pictures with Eric's family, Douglas, his wife, their son. Harold had stood behind the crowd, clapping quietly unseen. Now, sitting in the half-light of his garage, those moments replayed like old film reels. The love, the pride, the disappointment all blurred together until he couldn't tell one from the other. He took another sip of cold coffee and muttered to the empty room, "I taught her to be strong, not to forget where she came from." But maybe he'd done both. His eyes landed on the framed photo of his wife again. She'd always said Rachel had his stubborn streak. "You're too much alike," she used to laugh. "That's why you'll fight and forgive each other forever." Forgiveness had always come easily to him, maybe too easily. He reached for a rag and wiped the grease from an old socket wrench, one of the first tools he'd bought as a young man. The metal gleamed faintly, reflecting the morning light. In that reflection, he caught sight of the lottery ticket pinned under a magnet on the wall. The same one Rachel had thrown at him. The same one that mocked every sacrifice he'd ever made. He stared at it for a long time, then switched off the light. The garage fell into shadow except for the small rectangle of paper glowing under the weak dawn. 3 days passed before I finally worked up the nerve to call the bank. A young woman named Donna answered with a tone so calm it felt like mercy. "Yes, Mr. Bennett, we can revoke joint access immediately. Do you want to issue new credentials as well?" "Yes," I said. "Lock it down." "Everything." She walked me through the process step by step, her voice steady as she dismantled what was left of my misplaced trust. When it was done, she said softly, "All set. No one but you can move a cent now." For the first time in years, I felt something close to control. That feeling lasted exactly 4 hours. My phone rang while I was eating scrambled eggs. The screen flashed, "Rachel." I almost let it go to voicemail, but some part of me, the foolish, hopeful part, answered, "Dad, what the hell did you do to my card?" Her voice came through like a storm. "It got declined at Nordstrom. Do you have any idea how embarrassing that was?" I set my fork down carefully. "I removed your access after you stole from my account. I didn't steal anything." She snapped. "It was family money. For family, for someone who actually contributes to this family." "Rachel," I said quietly, "you didn't ask. You just took it." Through the phone, I heard the shuffle of shopping bags, the ambient hum of a mall. Do you even know how that felt? Standing there with an $800 handbag, and the cashier tells me my card is declined, everyone staring. I closed my eyes. I'm sorry you were embarrassed, but that doesn't change what you did. What I did? She laughed, sharp, brittle. What I did was treat Douglas with respect, something you've never learned. Respect isn't measured in money. Maybe not for you, she shot back, but for people who actually succeed, it is. Her words landed like hammer blows, everyone forged from years of resentment I hadn't seen forming. You're going to regret this, Dad, she said suddenly, her voice low and deliberate. You think you can humiliate me and just walk away? There will be consequences. Rachel, click. The silence that followed was so complete I could hear the refrigerator hum. I looked down at my cold eggs and pushed the plate away. Even reheated, they'd taste like ash. That evening I tried to drown the noise of my thoughts in television. A nature documentary, a rerun sitcom, a news segment on property taxes, none of it stuck. My tablet sat on the coffee table. For 2 days I'd avoided it, afraid of what I might see online. Curiosity finally won. Facebook opened to a single post pinned at the top of my feed. Rachel's profile photo smiled at me through perfect lighting and tears she'd practiced in the mirror. Having to write this breaks my heart, but I need support right now. My father decided to cut off my access to what has always been our family's money. After years of me managing his finances and caring for him, since Mom passed, he suddenly claims I can't be trusted. All because I bought Douglas a man who has done more for us than anyone, a Father's Day gift with money sitting unused. I never thought my own father could be so selfish and cruel. 47 likes, 23 comments. So sorry, Rachel. Older parents can get so paranoid about money. Your dad should be grateful to have you. Each word chipped away another piece of me. I scrolled down numb. There was a picture Rachel red-eyed but flawless, holding a coffee cup like a prop of grief. The caption, "When love turns to control, what do you do?" I didn't recognize my own daughter. By morning, the post had spread through the neighborhood. The cashier at the market looked at me differently. 2 men outside the hardware store stopped talking when I walked by. Then Eric joined in. He posted on LinkedIn, of all places, in that smug corporate tone he reserved for networking events. Witnessing financial elder abuse is painful, but reverse abuse, when elders weaponize money against their children, is equally damaging. My wife is heartbroken. A simple gift became a war. I pray compassion wins over greed. The comments poured in from his colleagues, financial advisors, bankers, people who didn't know me but pretended they did. They called me controlling, stingy, toxic. I shut my laptop before the screen burned a hole through my sanity. By afternoon, my sister Linda called. "Harold," she said gently. "What's going on?" "Rachel called me. She said you froze her out, that you're—" She hesitated, losing touch. "She stole $13,000, I said flatly. "That's what's going on. Maybe there's been a misunderstanding." "There isn't," I replied. She admitted it. Linda exhaled a long, weary sound. "I'm sorry. I never imagined she'd do that." Neither did I. After we hung up, I sat in the quiet house, surrounded by the kind of silence that doesn't comfort, it accuses. The photo of Rachel at 10 still sat on my shelf, smiling through time, completely unaware of what she'd grow into. That night, the notifications kept buzzing like mosquitoes. I turned off my phone, but the noise lived in my head now. How fast people choose sides when money enters the story. By day 3, the situation had grown legs. Someone from a local news blog messaged me asking for a comment on the alleged financial dispute. Another asked if I'd consider an interview to clear my name. But I didn't want cameras. I wanted my daughter back. Instead, I printed out her post and Eric's. I laid them across my kitchen table like evidence in a trial, black ink on white paper spelling out betrayal in Times New Roman. I whispered to the empty air, "You win, Rachel. You always wanted attention. Now you've got it." Outside, the mailman slowed his steps when he saw me through the window. The world had shrunk to the size of a rumor, and I was its villain. That night I went for a walk to clear my head. The neighborhood glowed under soft rain. Mrs. Langston waved from her porch but didn't call out my name. Maybe she'd read the posts. Maybe she just didn't know what to say. I stopped at the corner under the flickering streetlight and thought about deleting my account, my phone, my whole life before this digital circus. Then the device buzzed in my pocket, unknown number. I almost ignored it, but something about the pattern of digits felt deliberate. "Mr. Bennett." The voice was older, composed. "This is William Pierce, Douglas's father." My pulse quickened. "Yes, I believe we need to talk." My grip tightened around the phone. "About what? The lottery ticket," he said simply, "and what I witnessed on Father's Day." My heart thudded once hard. You were there, I was. "And I think it's time someone set the record straight. Could we meet Murphy's Diner 10 a.m.? He hung up before I could answer. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of something close to hope and fear. I stared at the phone, at my reflection in its dark screen. Maybe the truth hadn't abandoned me yet. Would you still stay silent if the truth was against your own child? Murphy's Diner sat on the corner of Burnside and 12th, one of those places that hadn't changed since the 70s. Red vinyl booths, chrome counters, and coffee strong enough to wake the dead. When I walked in the next morning, the smell of frying bacon hit me like a memory. William Pierce was already there, sitting in a booth by the window, his navy suit looking out of place among truckers and retirees. He rose when he saw me, extending a hand that felt firm and deliberate. "Mr. Bennett," he said, voice low and courteous. "Thank you for coming." "Couldn't imagine why you'd want to talk to me," I replied, sliding into the booth across from him. "Because," he said, stirring his coffee, "I witnessed something your daughter seems to have forgotten." He didn't waste time. "I was at that Father's Day dinner, Mr. Bennett. I watched Rachel throw that lottery ticket across the table. She called it a joke. A gift. There was no agreement, no talk of sharing winnings. It was clear to everyone there." I stared at him, trying to read his face. "Why tell me this now?" He leaned back, sighing. "Because my son and daughter-in-law are destroying your reputation with lies and, by extension, mine. I raised Douglas to be an honest man, but somewhere along the line he started confusing wealth with worth." I stayed silent, unsure whether to trust him. William pulled out his phone, scrolling with practiced precision until he found what he wanted. "I plan to post a public statement. I thought you should know before it goes live." He turned the screen toward me. The text glowed in the diner's dim light. "As a witness to the Father's Day gathering at Harold Bennett's home, I can confirm that the lottery ticket in question was presented as a gift without condition or verbal agreement. Mr. Bennett is the rightful owner of that ticket and any winnings associated with it. The ongoing public accusations are false and deeply disappointing to me as both a father and a man of integrity." He hesitated, thumb hovering over the post button. "You don't owe me anything, Mr. Bennett, but you deserve the truth." I blinked against the sudden sting in my eyes. "If you do this, they'll turn on you." He smiled faintly. "Let them. I built my name on honesty. I won't die watching it rot in silence." With a decisive tap, the statement went live. Within minutes, notifications exploded across his phone screen. Comments poured in, business partners, church members, old friends. People believed him. The tide at last had turned. For the first time in weeks, I breathed without pain. We sat there a while longer, watching the diner's morning rhythm waitresses refilling mugs, a kid spinning on a stool, a jukebox crooning some forgotten country song. "You know," William said quietly, "it's not just money that corrupts. It's entitlement. I gave Douglas everything. Education, opportunity, security, and somehow that became his excuse to stop earning things." I nodded slowly. Maybe that's what happened to Rachel too. He looked out the window. They were made for each other, I suppose. A sad truth, simple and final. We parted outside the diner. William's driver waited in a black sedan. He gripped my hand again before leaving. "You keep your head up, Harold. Truth doesn't always win fast, but it wins clean." He climbed into the car and disappeared down the street. By that afternoon, the internet had found its next obsession, William's post. "Breaking witness speaks out in lottery scandal. Businessman defends victim of family greed." Every headline carried my name now, but this time not as a villain. My phone buzzed nonstop with messages from neighbors, co-workers, even strangers. Glad the truth came out. We knew something didn't add up. The same people who'd ignored me days ago now wanted to talk, to apologize, to feel close to the story again. I answered none of them. Instead, I stood at my front window, watching the rain fall over the same street that had felt like a cage only days before. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like survival. The next morning, I found an envelope wedged in my mailbox, handwritten "No return address." I opened it at the kitchen table. Dad, you didn't have to drag strangers into this. You could have handled it privately. Now everyone's talking. Eric's furious, and you've humiliated me. I hope you're happy. Rachel. No apology, just accusation wrapped in self-pity. I folded the letter neatly and slid it under the stack of unpaid utility bills. Somehow it belonged there with all the other debts I'd never collect. That evening I walked to the park near my house. The air smelled of wet cedar and earth. Kids were playing on the swings, their laughter echoing under gray skies. One little girl fell and scraped her knee. Her father rushed to her side, brushing off the dirt. "You're okay, kiddo," he said softly. For a moment I saw myself 30 years younger, holding Rachel the same way. She'd looked up at me with absolute trust back then, a kind of faith I didn't deserve anymore. I sat on a bench until dusk watching the lights come on in nearby houses. Families eating dinner, talking, arguing, existing together. It used to comfort me. Now it just reminded me what I'd lost. When I got home, my answering machine blinked with 3 new messages, all reporters. I deleted them one by one. The last message, though, wasn't from a reporter. It was from William. "Harold," his voice said, "calm but tired. For what it's worth, you handled yourself with dignity. They may never admit they were wrong, but you don't have to carry their shame anymore. Good night, my friend." I stood in the dark kitchen for a long time after that, listening to the machine click off. Truth had finally defended me. But in doing so, it had also confirmed what I already knew. I'd lost my daughter long before the world found out who she'd become. I picked up the lottery ticket from where it hung on the fridge, the edges curling slightly. It was still just paper, worthless, forgotten, yet somehow heavier than any sum of money. I slipped it into my wallet, not as proof, but as a reminder that love, when corrupted by pride, becomes debt. Outside, thunder rumbled over Portland's skyline. I whispered to the empty house. "You were wrong, Rachel. Respect isn't bought, it's earned." And for the first time in months, I meant it. That night, sleep never came. The storm outside rumbled like an argument that refused to end. I sat at my kitchen table, the letter from Rachel beside my coffee cup and a blank sheet of paper in front of me. For a long time, I stared at the page, pen in hand, unsure if I wanted to write or scream. "Dear Rachel," I began. Then I stopped. How do you write to someone who's erased you from their story? The wind howled through the chimney and rain hammered against the glass. I imagined her reading my words not with remorse, but with the same detached pity she'd shown at dinner that night. She'd see it as weakness, another plea from the father she'd outgrown. Still, the words spilled quietly onto the paper. "You don't owe me gratitude, Rachel. You owe yourself the truth. The day you traded love for status, you didn't gain a better life, you just lost a home." The ink blurred where my hand trembled. I folded the page once, twice, but couldn't bring myself to put it in an envelope. Some messages weren't meant to be sent. They were meant to be released. I carried it to the fireplace, struck a match, and watched the flames curl around the paper. It burned fast, leaving only a curl of ash that lifted into the air and vanished. The rain softened outside like the world exhaling. For the first time, I didn't feel angry, just empty. Maybe that was peace in disguise. The morning after the storm broke clear and cold, the kind of Portland morning that smelled of wet asphalt and pine. Sunlight spilled across the street, glinting off puddles that mirrored the gray sky. I stepped outside with my coffee, half expecting the world to still be whispering about me. But it wasn't. Mrs. Langston waved from her porch. The mailman nodded. The same people who had once avoided my eyes now greeted me again cautiously, as if nothing had happened. Funny thing about redemption, it always arrives too late to matter. I walked slowly down the block, my boots splashing through thin puddles. Every house looked the same as before, but I wasn't. Something in me had burned out quietly, leaving behind a hollow kind of peace. When I reached the small park at the end of the street, the same bench where I'd sat nights ago, the world felt heavier and lighter all at once. Children were playing. Parents laughed, exchanged stories about schools and rent and broken appliances, simple problems, manageable ones. I used to envy people without complicated families. Now I pitied them a little. They had no idea how fragile peace really was. I sat sipping what was left of my coffee. The smell of roasted beans and wet grass mixed in the air, and my thoughts drifted where they always went to Rachel. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't even sad. Just tired of remembering her only in ways that hurt. Somewhere along the line, I'd confused love with sacrifice. Every late night, every overtime shift, every canceled plan, I'd told myself that giving everything was the same as being a good father. But love without boundaries isn't devotion. It's erasure. I had erased myself $1 at a time until there was nothing left but what she could take. I leaned back on the bench, watching the clouds drift like slow ships across the sky. If my wife were here, she'd scold me gently. "You raised her to believe she never had to earn love," Harold, she would say. "You gave too much too easily." She'd be right. I thought providing meant protecting. I thought protection meant love. But love, real love, has to teach consequence. And I'd failed her there. A breeze rustled through the cedars, carrying the faint scent of rain. I closed my eyes and let it pass through me. When I got back home, the house was quiet in the familiar way again. Not lonely, just honest. The kind of quiet that didn't need to apologize. I went straight to the garage. It had always been my sanctuary, but I'd avoided it since the scandal began, afraid it would remind me of all the years I'd worked for someone who no longer respected the labor behind the love. The dust was thick on every surface. I ran a hand over my workbench, stirring up a cloud that sparkled in the sunlight. The old '67 Mustang sat under a tarp in the corner, its red paint dulled by years of neglect. For weeks, I'd told myself I didn't have the energy to restore it. But that morning something changed. I grabbed my wrench. The first turn of the bolt felt like a confession, the sound of metal loosening after being held too tight for too long. Piece by piece, the engine began to come apart in my hands. Oil, grease, rust, all of it grounding me in a way no therapy ever could. This was what I understood: things break, but they can be fixed if you stop pretending they're fine. Hours passed without notice. By the time I set my tools down, sunlight was bleeding orange through the garage windows. The car wasn't running yet, but neither was I stuck anymore. I sat on the stool, wiping my hands with an old rag, and looked around. Every corner of that garage told my story: work, loss, effort, hope. No lies, no performance, just me. There's a peace that comes when you finally stop begging people to see you. I realized then that I didn't need Rachel's apology to heal. I just needed to stop waiting for it. Maybe one day she'd understand what she'd done. Maybe she wouldn't. Either way, I'd already forgiven her, not because she deserved it, but because I did. I walked back into the house as twilight fell. The world outside glowed blue-gray streetlights flickering on one by one. On the kitchen table sat my wallet, and inside it, the lottery ticket creased, faded, but still there. I pulled it out and stared at it under the warm lamplight. That tiny piece of paper had destroyed and saved me all at once. It wasn't money that changed my life. It was the moment I stopped letting guilt define my love. I slipped the ticket back into my wallet and poured myself a cup of tea. Outside, the rain started again, gentle this time, tapping like a heartbeat against the window. I opened my old notebook, the one I'd used for bills and grocery lists, and turned to a blank page. At the top, I wrote a single line in shaky pen: "Let go, but don't forget." The rest of the page stayed empty. It didn't need more. I closed the notebook, turned off the light, and let the dark settle around me like a blanket. Some endings don't need closure. They just need silence. Sometimes you lose your child to find yourself again. That night, the air felt heavier than usual, soaked in the scent of wet cedar. I sat by the window, a single lamp glowing beside me, listening to the hush between raindrops. The phone on the table vibrated once, an unknown number, but I didn't need to see the caller ID. I knew. For a long time, I just stared at it, watching the name Rachel flicker and fade as the call went to voicemail. Her silence afterward said more than any apology could. Outside, the rain came harder, blurring the world beyond the glass. In the reflection, my face merged with the dark window pane, half man, half memory. I whispered into the empty room, "I forgive you, sweetheart, but forgiveness isn't forgetting, it's freeing." Then I turned off the lamp. The room slipped into quiet darkness, except for the rhythmic tapping of rain and the steady beating of my own heart. It wasn't the sound of loneliness anymore. It was the sound of release. And for the first time in years, I let myself believe that maybe tomorrow would simply be ordinary. The morning sky over Portland was the color of wet steel. For the first time in months, I woke before the alarm, not from worry but from quiet purpose. The kettle hissed softly on the stove as I poured coffee into my favorite chipped mug. The steam fogged my glasses, blurring the world in a way that almost felt merciful. On the table lay an envelope with the state seal of Oregon printed in gold. I'd opened it the night before but hadn't really read it until now. Oregon Lottery Commission, official presentation ceremony, 10:00 a.m., Salem headquarters. I stared at the words for a long time. It still felt surreal. The same piece of paper I'd nearly thrown away had become a fortune. But the money wasn't what weighed on me. The attention was. The news had spread fast after William's statement. The media wanted their redemption arc, their repentant father, their soundbite. They wanted me to smile for the cameras and pretend the story had a happy ending. I wasn't sure I had that in me. My coffee had gone cold when the clock struck 8. Outside, the streets were slick with rain, reflecting the light like liquid silver. I stood at the window for a long moment before muttering to myself, "All right then. Let's get it over with." The lottery office in Salem was a glass fortress, modern, gleaming, impersonal. Cameras lined the lobby. Journalists huddled near the entrance, their umbrellas dripping like black wings. A woman in a navy suit greeted me with a practiced smile. "Mr. Bennett, we're honored to have you. Are you ready?" "As ready as I'll ever be," I said, straightening my tie, the same one I'd worn to my wife's funeral. Inside the auditorium, rows of chairs faced a small stage draped in banners that read, "Congratulations, Oregon's newest millionaire." It felt absurd. I'd spent 40 years fixing broken engines for people who never remembered my name. Now, strangers wanted my autograph. When they called me up, applause filled the room. It didn't sound like celebration. It sounded like noise, distant, hollow, detached from anything real. A tall man with a microphone asked the first question. "Mr. Bennett, how does it feel to go from mechanic to millionaire overnight?" I adjusted the microphone, thinking of all the things I could say. Then I smiled faintly. "Strange," I said. "Money fixes a lot of things, but it doesn't fix people." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd. I wasn't joking. Another reporter leaned forward. "What are your plans for the winnings?" I looked at the oversized check they'd handed me, numbers so large they barely fit across the paper. "I think I'll rebuild something that can't be bought," I said. "Integrity, trust, maybe even hope." Someone asked, "Will you reconcile with your daughter?" The question hit harder than I expected. I took a slow breath. "That's not up to me," I answered softly. "All I can do is live the kind of life she can be proud of again if she ever chooses to look back." The room went quiet. For a moment, even the flashbulbs paused. When the ceremony ended, officials posed beside me, smiling for photos. I smiled too, but it wasn't for them. It was for the man I used to be, the one who'd lost himself trying to hold on to love that didn't want to stay. Outside, the drizzle had started again, thin and cold. I walked to my car, carrying the ceremonial check rolled under my arm like a joke no one would get. As I reached the parking lot, I noticed a figure standing beside a silver sedan. Rachel. Her hair was damp, her expression unreadable. For a second, I thought she might approach, say something, anything, but she just stood there staring. Then, without a word, she turned and got into her car. I didn't call out. I just watched her drive away until the taillights disappeared into traffic. The drive back to Portland felt longer than usual. Rain traced thin veins across the windshield. At a red light, I glanced at the passenger seat where the oversized check rested like an unwanted guest. $120 million, I muttered, and not a single thing I actually want. The light turned green. When I got home, the house smelled faintly of sawdust and coffee, the same way it had on the morning Rachel left for college. I set the check on the counter, loosened my tie, and walked into the living room. On the mantel above the fireplace hung the framed photo of my wife. Her smile was quiet, knowing the same way it had been when she used to scold me gently. "You were right," I said to her photo. "It wasn't the money. It was me." I sat down in my old recliner, the one with worn arms and a small tear in the cushion. Outside, the rain grew heavier, but I didn't mind. There was something comforting about the sound. It filled the spaces words couldn't reach. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man who'd lost everything. I felt like someone who'd finally stopped pretending to fix what was already gone. I closed my eyes and let the sound of the rain carry me somewhere between memory and forgiveness. And when I finally opened them, the world didn't look new. It just looked real again. 2 weeks passed before I heard the sound of footsteps outside the garage. I was tightening the last bolt on the Mustang's engine when the shadow crossed the doorway. Rachel stood there. Her hair was tangled, her face pale beneath smudged makeup. She looked smaller somehow, like the world had finally stopped protecting her. "Dad," she said softly, her voice cracking. I didn't know where else to go. I wiped my hands on a rag and waited. She stepped closer, clutching her phone like a lifeline. "Eric's gone," she whispered. "He took everything. The house, the accounts, even Jake's college fund. We're drowning, Dad. I just need help, just enough to start over. 2 million, maybe." The number hit like a familiar echo. I'd heard that tone before, the bargaining between guilt and entitlement. I set the wrench down gently. "Rachel," I said, keeping my voice calm, "I can't fix what you keep breaking." Her eyes filled with tears. "You're really going to let your own daughter lose everything I already did," I said quietly. The silence that followed was longer than any argument we'd ever had. She took a shaky breath, nodded as if memorizing my face one last time, and walked away. From the doorway, I watched her get into her car. When the engine started, the sound mixed with the hum of my Mustang, the old machine coming to life again after all those years. I smiled sadly. Guess we both needed rebuilding. As her car disappeared down the road, I turned back to the workbench where my wife's picture watched over me. The radio crackled to life with a song we used to dance to, slow and quiet. I leaned against the car, closed my eyes, and whispered, "Voices fade, but guilt echoes louder." Outside, rain began to fall again, soft and steady like forgiveness learning how to breathe. Take care of yourself and of those who still stand by you. Sometimes the heart needs peace more than proof. If this story touched you, subscribe and share your thoughts below. Thank you for watching.